I think it's nice if we get started so we can use everyone's time efficiently. So thank you very much for being here. It's larger turnout than expected, which is a good news, and we realize that this topic maybe isn't covered as much as we wanted in other parts of the university. So my name is Anthony Ling. For those who haven't met me previously, I'm an MBA 2 here at Stanford, and I'm probably the only MBA with a background in architecture and urban planning at the school, which is sort of unfortunate, I guess. So I studied architecture and urban planning in Brazil. I worked as an architect in Brazil for 2.5 years. I did some research in urban planning and urban policy independently. I have a website where I write about urban planning called Planejado. We wrote a small book on urban policy development focused on Brazil. And previously to the GSB, I started a ride-sharing microtransit startup in Brazil, which is a topic that I'm going to briefly talk about today. I'm going to try to talk fast because there's a lot to, I think it's interesting to cover. And also to grab your attention, I'll have some interesting photos, see if everyone's interested in the topic. So we're going to cover a little bit of urban planning. It's not a topic that most of us are in contact with in a daily basis. What cities have been doing regarding urban mobility, some lessons and inspiration from developing countries and how it's being adopted in developed countries, and a little bit about the future of transportation. So why? I think one of the reasons is the demand, right? I think there's a lot of people talking about urban mobility and transportation at the GSB. A number of people have talked to me about this topic my first year as an MBA. And as I've given a few talks on this subject in Brazil, I thought it would be an interesting idea to have this BDL. Another reason is that there's a huge disconnect between the academic and urban planning and urban policy sphere and the business people and entrepreneurs who are innovating in this sector. For those who have used Twitter and are following this topic, very recently this planner called Jared Walker and Yona Freemark, they kind of criticized Elon Musk's work mostly in transportation regarding private vehicles, and Elon Musk replied, "You're an idiot," and a tweet storm broke after that. And also regarding business ideas and business models in this world, right? So around 2015, Uber launched a service called Uber Rush, and a lot of the prospects and ideas around this service is that it would deliver food and people kind of at the same time. The Uber driver would stop throughout someone's ride to pick up someone else's lunch or something like that. A lot of investors, a lot of entrepreneurs believe this idea. It would really increase efficiency in transportation, but people that were already in contact with logistics and how the differences between packaging delivery and people delivery already noticed it would be a problem. And Uber discontinued this service recently, passed it all over to Uber Eats, and they have different drivers for different services. So let's get a little bit of urban planning and urban history. So urban planning actually starts around the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, cities grew very, very fast for the first time in humanity. So a lot of people living close to factories. It was very dirty, very polluted, a lot of water contamination, and just a lot of people living in the same place for the first time in mankind. So the theory back then was the miasma theory, the theory that diseases spread out through bad air, and that was a result of this concentration of a lot of people in the same place. We later discovered the bacterial theory and noticed that a lot of these diseases were actually being spread through water contamination and not this bad air theory. And interestingly, a lot of the first urban theories on how cities should be developed through this notion of bad air, and that people should be actually spread out in the territory with lots of contact to green and open spaces. The garden city was one of the first theories that defended this kind of urban development. The central city would be restricted to a small core, and other urban areas would be connected to this core through a network of roads. And note that this is previous to the ubiquitous use of the automobile. So people were still transporting themselves with horses and carriages. Soon the car was benefited by this model of garden city where everything was very spread out. And the car companies and the American way of life did a strong marketing campaigns to promote the use of the car in the United States, and that eventually spread out worldwide. So this is an interesting flyer that was distributed in the 20s and 30s to basically criminalize crossing the street, which was the norm back then, right? So car companies would ridicule people who cross the street in order to give preference or right of way to automobiles, which wasn't the case beforehand. There was also lobbying efforts to increase or to invest in road infrastructure instead of other kinds of infrastructure. So videos promoted by GM for the interstate highway system, which is one of the largest investments in road infrastructure in the world. Another very strong mechanism used in urban planning is zoning. So thinking about when factories started to attract people and to be one of the main developments the main attractors in urban development, urban planners thought it would be interesting to separate, like this is the industrial zone, this is the commercial zone, this is the residential zone, a concept that did not exist up until the Industrial Revolution. The problem with this concept in many ways is that it was in many cases used as a segregation tool. So if we see at this map of Birmingham in 1926, the red areas are industrial areas, but we can see that residential area right in the middle of the industrial area, which is zoned for working class housing. So it was just a way that the planning elites would dominate this kind of zoning to segregate the communities in different parts of the city. Zoning also increases a lot of distance in transportation. So cities that are strongly zoned have a residential area in a different part of where people work, which wasn't the norm. I mean, in cities, in medieval cities or cities growing up until this time. If you look at older downtown areas, even in the United States, the mixed use is much more of the norm instead of this zoned urban development. And it's interesting to see that today it's very hard to break the zoned mentality. So SimCity does not allow to build in an unzoned way. Everything is zoned for those who have played it. And it's sort of unfortunate because this is very ingrained in our society right now, but it also was generated from this kind of segregationist and separationist way of looking at cities. A result of this in the United States, this is a photo of Phoenix. So urban sprawl is quite a problem in the US. It's a problem because there's a much higher investment in infrastructure per capita, basically because everything is spread out. And it eliminates most of the other options of transportation, if not the private automobile. If distances are so far from each other, if uses are separated from each other, it's very hard for any of us to walk anywhere, to bike anywhere, or even to walk to a mass transit station. So no mass transit solution can work in this kind of urban development because there's no concentration of demand that makes it make sense to invest in a high infrastructure investment. So another important urban theory that came up right after the Garden City is this modernist way of looking at cities. It was sort of inspired in this miasma theory of we must have open spaces and green areas, but it also had this kind of engineering view behind it. So let's build bigger buildings, taller buildings, and increase efficiency while maintaining these open areas for the population. So this is an interesting concept plan for Paris, and this is right in the central Paris, so that's the Seine River, which fortunately did not come through. Le Corbusier was a very famous and influential Swiss architect and urban planner. So European cities at this time were already mostly fully developed, so the modernist ideas were mostly implemented in the outskirts of these cities with time. You can see like these residential blocks if you go to the outskirts of most European cities. And in Brazil, we have our capital, which was built in '57, which is one of the world's most prime examples of how this modernist idea could be implemented because it was designed from scratch with these concepts. So very wide roads, very large residential and commercial blocks, everything is zoned, and also a very hard city to solve in terms of transportation because still it's not walkable, things are very distant from each other. The mass transit system doesn't work because of that. It's very hard to bike because it's dangerous, and it's to be said it's one of the cities that sidewalks are almost non-existent. And from my experience in the American suburbs, in many places, sidewalks also don't exist outside the planned communities because you're always on a highway. So the shape of buildings can be misleading sometimes. We think about tall buildings equals more people in the same place. That's not always true. So if we look at São Paulo, who was largely inspired by this like tall building and separated from each other model of urban development. So São Paulo has about, in average, half the population density as Paris, which is much more compact and low-rise, just because the buildings are connected to each other and the units are much smaller. So when we're looking at what kind of transportation solution makes sense, a very good metric to be looking at is population density, because it many times is related to how walkable the place is. So these setbacks between buildings that are very prevalent in Latin American cities and Asian cities, and in some new urban developments in downtown areas in the US. They are also decreasing the walkability of the neighborhood. So these numbers were taken from one of the first studies made in Brazil, comparing or relating the setbacks between buildings and the number of pedestrians that are walking at that street in any given time. So if we can see that as we increase the distance between buildings, the number of pedestrians crossing decreases a lot. And this happens because basically the building is far from whatever is happening on the sidewalk. So if we look at cities like New York, the buildings are right on the sidewalks, and whoever's been to New York, probably most of you or all of you, the buildings that are not right on the sidewalk, you actually don't have any kind of connection to retail that's happening there. So this decreases any sort of commercial or retail activity that's going on. New York was built in most part without kind of Euclidean zoning of uses and rules regarding setbacks at the sidewalk level. So it's by far one of the most dense and walkable cities in the US and some would say the world. And it's it ends up being much different from the rest of most of the United States. Because services like bike deliveries, walking deliveries, motorcycle deliveries, mass transit, they become viable in this sort of urban environment. This was also the case with historical European cities. So this is a picture of Paris. And also in historical downtown areas in cities in Latin America and also in Southeast Asia that were developed before these new urban theories that took place worldwide. There's this interesting website called WalkScore, where you can input the city that you live in and it will spit out a walk score, transit score, and bike score. So you can see the difference between New York and Phoenix. And it says that New York is very walkable, Phoenix is very car dependent because of these metrics or these urban characteristics that I described previously. So what have cities been doing? Cities are still investing a significant amount in road infrastructure building all over the world. This is a problem because the theory that people use usually is just to attack or to deal with the supply of roads when they look at traffic, but they're not restricting the demand. So they're not decreasing the demand for automobile use. And what happens, and most urban planners today have kind of an agreement about this, is that the more you widen these roads and these arterial roads, the more you're inducing demand, because you create traffic flow for automobiles, and that is basically subsidizing increased use of automobiles. Also, every major highway development or road widening project or overpass, it will change the urban environment. So the white lines were the previous lots or the previous urban form that existed in place of this road ring. And anyone who's ever passed or walked around one of these rings will know that it's very hard to cross it, very hard to access mass transit if you're near it. There are no activities that are valuable or attractive around these road rings. So every major urban investment in this kind of infrastructure ends up decreasing walkability, decreasing access to mass transit, and promoting the use of the automobile as a single solution to transportation. More recently, urban planners are fighting against this kind of development and trying to promote other uses of transportation. So you can see in this picture that compares the space occupied by cars, a bus, and people walking and biking for the same number of people using three different transportation modes. And I mean, this is a nice illustration on why, if we only promote one sort of mobility solution that takes up a lot of space, it's very expensive in terms of occupying real estate space in public roads. So another metric planners and transportation specialists use a lot to kind of identify where a city is in that sense is called the Modeshare, or what mode of transportation is being used in each city. So the yellow is private transportation, both cars and taxis. So you see cities like Chicago and Sydney very dependent on car use. Still kind of 1/4, 1/5 of people walking, which is the gray slice of the pie, and a very small percentage of mass transit use in the cities. And this pattern is basically replicated in the entire US, with a few exceptions like SF or New York. Brazil is kind of a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 still. There is some incentive by planners to kind of decrease this pie of car use, but still the desire to own a car is very big. It's a very popular idea. And some cities, so both in developing countries and developing cities and developed cities that have been able to have a very large percentage of their population using mass transportation, like Bogota and Seoul, are two examples of cities that were able to develop themselves in a different path. So Singapore is one of the world's most interesting examples because they curbed congestion not by increasing the supply of roads, but by restricting the demand on roads. So they have the most sophisticated system of automatized congestion charge, which is basically a pay-to-drive sort of inner city tolling system, which is more effective or more sophisticated than the London congestion charge, which is just going in and out of the city center. These portals mark where you're going, and it's a bit more detailed, how they're charging for you to drive the streets. So from my experience in Singapore, there's not a lot of traffic, and they've been able to deal with this situation very well. For some of you have been reading about this, but New York is discussing the implementation of a congestion charge, and it would be the first city in the US to have this kind of solution implemented. Another thing most cities do is having minimum parking restrictions for new building developments, and also offering free parking for public spaces. So this kind of policy also incentivizes car use because you're basically giving public space for free for those who drive, and you're also basically mandating everyone who's buying an office space or residential space to pay for a parking space. So I mean, in Palo Alto, you have to build one parking space for every 250 feet on average, and from 1.5 to 4 spaces for each residential unit you're building. So basically, you're already paid for a parking space, and you're kind of incentivized to use it after you own it. So the guy who wrote this book, Donald Shoup, The High Cost of Free Parking, he estimates that driving for a parking space in urban city areas is responsible for 30% of the traffic in these areas, just because people are looking for that free parking space or a cheap parking space instead of putting in a private garage where they're gonna have to pay full price or market price. So just like a lot of traffic that's going on, and it generates a lot of inefficiencies. And some cities like SF have taken on and trying to tackle this problem. So they implemented a dynamic pricing meter system. I don't know if you guys have heard of this. So it was like the first city in the world who tried this. They put sensors on each parking space, and they basically adjust price on the meters according to demand. And the goal, at least for this project, is to always leave one space open per block, so cars can always go out of the street and park and not do this driving around thing to look for a spot. Cities are also doing very large investments in light rail, not only in the US, but all over the world. Light rail is kind of a problem. One reason is because the motivation behind building light rail many times isn't according to demand or to a viability study. It's many times driven by it looks nice, or it looks like a European city, or it looks different from what we have. And this is actually true. Some politicians kind of adopt these objectives, and they promote one specific sort of technology without necessarily doing a full viability study on if that is in fact the right solution for that city. So this graph shows some American cities that have invested in light rail in the last few decades. So the straight lines are the transit mode share. So the blue line is Portland, so the transit mode share was dropping and they built the light rail and it increased a little bit and then it dropped again. But the other cities didn't show a huge increase in the transit share because of the light rail investment. So this kind of, if you build it, they will come, not always works. Also, bus rapid transit is another solution that SF is building right now. Bus rapid transit is kind of a special bus that has a dedicated lane and an elevated platform that you can board, kind of like a subway in the same level. It's supposed to be a bit faster and a bit more efficient than a regular bus line that gets stuck on traffic and has slower boarding. This technology has been very widespread in developing countries because it's much cheaper than rail. You don't need like the special vehicles or it's just a bus that's a little bit better. The problem with the San Francisco bus rapid transit is that its costs right now are similar to light rail projects in other parts of the world. So it's interesting to see that in the US, rail costs and costs in infrastructure building for transportation are much higher than other parts of the world. There was a study done by there was a news article done by the New York Times in December last year that pointed out that the New York subway is by far the most expensive to build all over the world. So some lessons and inspirations from developing countries that I find interesting. So this is a picture of the colectivos in Lima. Many developing country cities have similar kinds of transportation with small vans. These operators usually are not strictly controlled or enforced by local governments. The private operators basically design the routes that they think have more demand. What's interesting about this system, usually it's that they're very cheap. And being smaller vehicles, they're capable to access a finer or a more direct route than larger vehicles that need sometimes transfers between stations or the last mile problem that a person has to walk 1 mile, 2 miles to the station. Interesting case is that the MIT did a research in Nairobi where they have the matatus, which are very similar transportations to the colectivos. They mapped where the vehicles were going with GPS, and they found out that the organic network of vehicles that the private operators were designing independently created a network that's kind of similarly designed to a top-down design network of vehicles. So I see a lot of relation between this kind of collectivo technology with the microtransit trend that's happening right now. So Chariot is a startup, it's a YC-backed startup in San Francisco. Bridge I think was founded in Boston. They closed, they got bought out, and now they're operating in Sydney. So these two companies have fixed line routes, and they kind of introduce new routes according to demand and how they feel the users are transporting themselves through the city. Via is an interesting company because they're Israel-based and they work with dynamic routes. So the vehicle is, instead of having a pre-designed route, it's a little bit like Uber Pool, where they drive around the city and they adapt the route dynamically according to the rider's demand. Another developing country technology are the auto rickshaws or Tuk Tuks, very common in Southeast Asia, in the Caribbean, where there's a lot of traffic, not a lot of space, and not a lot of resources for larger vehicles. So while these are seen as many times a problem in these countries, Lisbon has recently introduced tuk tuks in their streets. So there are around 300 to 400 tuk tuks right now riding the streets of Lisbon because I don't know who has been there, but the streets are very narrow. There are a lot of inclined streets that are hard to go up with larger vehicles or by foot. So this seems to be an interesting transportation solution for the city of Lisbon. So delivery logistics ideas. So this is what they call a Motoboy in Brazil. So most of the food deliveries and small package deliveries in Brazil are done by motorcycle with this box in the back. This is a startup that tapped into this market and created an app where people can order or send packages in a short period of time, and also serving restaurants, kind of like Uber Eats. And Deliveroo is a company that's doing a similar solution in Europe. What I find interesting about companies like this, or even Uber Eats, is that many times these innovations and solutions have already been working and in practice in developing countries for quite some time. And when they're introduced either in the US or in Europe, it's like something very groundbreaking, and they raise 10 times as much capital as the previous startup in the developed country was able to raise, just because of their locational advantage. So I find interesting that a lot of solutions are possible, and maybe in the future these apps that combine and integrate routes will be more common, because having this kind of wide array of transportation solutions that they kind of don't know what's more efficient at each time. So some startups are already working in helping the client or the passenger to see what makes more sense at any given time for different routes. So looking at the future, we've all heard about autonomous vehicles here, and I won't spend a lot of time on that. Some companies have already been deploying their test phase in private communities where they have more control of the environment, like Voyage. The information report on CES thought that the technology is still a bit far from being implemented in a widespread, scalable case. So I think we'll see these cars driving around for testing for a few more years before we have a significant change on how we transport ourselves with autonomous vehicles. So interesting thing are the hypotheses of what will happen with autonomous vehicles, looking at different standpoints and different perspectives, right? So what urban planners say right now is that autonomous vehicles will increase traffic significantly. One of the reasons is because it's going to decrease the cost of driving a lot. And this decrease in cost of driving will also potentially end mass transit or have the governments highly subsidize mass transit for it to be able to work. Because right now, mass transit depends on a large number of people using those vehicles. And if a lot of people transition into using autonomous vehicle services, these services will end up failing. So a lot of criticism from urban planners right now is that these autonomous vehicles will actually increase our spending in road infrastructure. They're going to increase the use of automobiles. They're going to be mostly for the elites who have access to these autonomous vehicles in a first wave, and also the case of sprawl, right? So since the beginning of cities, with every new major transportation innovation, from the horse to the carriage to the trolley to the car, cities have seen a wave of sprawl, because you can basically transport yourself more and cheaper and faster. So what urban planners predict with autonomous vehicles is that people will end up living even further away. And this will generate even more inefficiencies with road infrastructure spending per capita. Another prediction is the end of parking, right? If autonomous vehicles are actually 100% autonomous, you don't have to park it somewhere. It can continue driving, picking up, and transporting other people during that time, or even be parked somewhere in the outskirts of the city where land is cheap, and you can just summon your vehicle whenever you need it. So adaptation of parking structures is also something that a lot of people are looking into right now because of AVs. This is another interesting prediction that autonomous vehicles will break down real estate services. So this is basically a hotel room that you would be able to summon through your smartphone, and it would take you from New York to Boston, right? So this is just a simulation done by a blogger that was thinking about how real estate markets and our consumption patterns will change with autonomous vehicles. So the last example is the Boring Company. This is the latest company started by Elon Musk. His goal is basically to create a three-dimensional network of tunnels where cars would go into and not drive, but move themselves in these skated platforms. His major pitch is that the tunneling costs are too high, and this would be a way to solve traffic or congestion problem. So there are lots of speculations regarding what he's actually trying to do. My opinion is that if you really want to solve traffic, the congestion charge is a way that has already been working in cities around the world, and uses much less investment than creating a three-dimensional network of tunnels. Some people speculate that he's actually wanting to increase his tunneling technology for Mars, for SpaceX, through another company. And interesting thing about what's happening with subway costs and tunneling costs in the US is that you see that the cost of building subways in the US is significantly larger than in other parts of the world, even in developed countries with similar sized cities. So one upside of this investigation Musk is doing that a lot of planners look at is that if he's actually able to bring down the cost of tunneling, maybe even for mass transit in the US, it could be very helpful. And it doesn't really matter how he does it. For the case of SpaceX, it was a lot of cutting costs politically and decreasing the bureaucracy in how to build rockets. Of course, there were a lot of technological advances, but the way subways are built in the US right now, and how the unions work, how the contracts work, it just inflates costs a lot. And so this is one of the upsides people are seeing with the Boring Company. So for those who are interested in further references, there are two books that are my two favorites regarding urban planning and cities. The Triumph of the City by Ed Glazer, which is a very contemporary, current book, and a classic, which is The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Maybe some of you read it in college or something. And some interesting Twitter handles that you could follow. The first one is mine. I tweet in Portuguese and English, so it's fine to read it. So yeah, I hope we still have a few minutes for like an open discussion or Q&A, and let's talk about whatever you're interested in. Thank you. Jen.
How do you see like Uber Elevate or the sort of vertical lift technologies playing into this?
I'm not familiar with Uber Elevate and vertical lift.
Okay, well, I don't know a ton about it, but basically like there's take off from one position rather than needing to have a runway for takeoff, but you can do that with planes now. So they have like larger carrying capacity than helicopters. And
Yeah,
that's like their
so-
whole thing, that'll be the next level of connection.
Yeah, so the thing is that it's kind of like the flying car thing, right? It's been predicted since like the 50s or something. From what I've read about it, it's still very far from happening. One major concern is safety, right? Because if you have like not a few planes or things flying around above our heads, but like thousands, it's a major hazard. And I doubt it that cities will actually approve this in a regulatory perspective. Which is also a problem with drone delivery. If you would have to have a mass drone delivery system in cities, like the sky would just be filled with packages moving around everywhere. I don't think it's, maybe it's a net positive, I can't be sure, but I don't think governments are gonna allow it very soon. Yeah.
So one of the points when you talk about autonomous cars, there was a bullet for less traffic, so I was curious what
Oh
the
yeah,
arguments are
yeah,
for that.
yeah.
And then the other question was when it comes to congestion tolls, how does that affect people who, like, you talked about how like autonomous cars are for elites only. Would the
Yeah.
tolls affect people who, you know, who can't afford to pay tolls, if
Yeah.
they don't have trains to, you know, move in from the suburbs?
Sure. So, okay, the first question is less traffic, right?
Mhm.
So there's one thing with traffic that depending on the speed you're driving, your car occupies more space, right? So when you're driving fast, yeah, you need like this space between cars, and when it's very slow, like cars are like this. So they say that with autonomous vehicles, because like the cars will be like very smart, and you won't need a lot of space between vehicles, and you could just ride very fast, and won't need like to brake every time, and just like streets will be very fast. And less accidents as well because of less human error. So that's one of the predictions where like people just predict that the traffic flow will just flow much more than it does right now. With tolls, the thing is that you're always investing, the public sector is always investing in some sort of transportation, right? If it's dedicating like many millions or billions of dollars in road infrastructure, it can help people in other ways. So I think it's a matter of budgeting on how you're helping people regarding their transportation needs. If there is like an inequity perspective, you can help them access through some sort of financing. But I think it's hard to say that like this, we'll have a very inefficient collapse system and without the congestion charge and just feeding more money into larger roads because of that. If I can explain better, like the use of tolls generate flow, and at least I don't really know the situation about the bus use in the US, but one of the problems with riding a bus in Brazil and a lot of developing countries is that it's stuck in traffic. So if you're tolling drivers, you're basically allowing people, or you're making the mass transit system better for everyone else, right? And you don't really have to toll bus because it's part of the policy. So I think it's a matter of like adjusting this policy and also creating alternatives. So allowing microtransit solutions to appear is also a way to increase the access of different collective transportation modes. So of course there are many variables, but it's kind of like let's see what's the right direction in each path. Yeah.
So on the city planning front or design front, we've got DC that was designed as a diamond. You talked about Brasilia. I don't know if you know about the Sidewalk Labs project in Toronto that Google's involved with. Can you think of other projects along those lines where space within major cities is being redesigned now, and so conceptually they're thinking about livability and mobility in conjunction?
So I don't know the details about the project, but the thing is that cities are very hard to plan. because they're considered like complex systems, right? This sort of planning theories that I showed, like zoning and like garden city, they're basically trying to say we've found an answer for the problems of the city that will disregard, let's say, market effects or the growth of the city in the long term. Whenever I see a image or a project of a city that has like a rendering, like a final built image, I'm very skeptical, because that's not how cities are not real estate developments. It's like a continuing process that change over centuries, right? So I tend to focus more on like metrics, like how much housing is a city building, how much time are people spending in transportation, what are the options of transportation available, what are the options of housing available, and how can we tackle these problems, instead of trying to create a all-encompassing solution that will theoretically solve all of these problems at once. Because it's not something that you will finish and then no one will ever die, or no one will ever leave the city or move into the city, right? It's a changing environment always. So yeah, I'm skeptical of the overarching solutions to cities.
So one problem I've struggled with a lot in the American context is it seems like in many cases you have this chicken and egg problem, where many environments sort of aren't sufficiently dense to support mass transit, so they resist efforts at densification because the only way you can get around is with a car. But unless you densify, you can't get around without a car. So like, what do we do about that? Like, how do you get from over the gap, like from here to there?
I'm usually the allow densification side first, because when you allow densification, you kind of see where the demand is, right? Because if you build like a large light rail line or a large mass transit system, it's not guaranteed that people will live there just because there's a line. Of course, it incentivizes people because it increases mobility, but it's not something that you're responding to demand, right? You're trying to guess, and you can lose, like governments can lose a lot of money by doing that. So what I believe in most is to allow cities to densify more, and you'll basically be able to see, okay, this is where people want to live, this is where people want to work, this is where people are going to school. Let's try to see what kind of transit lines, or not even like a super mass transit system, or like, let's see how we can insert like a van service to serve these people and kind of iterate from there. Instead of saying, okay, let's invest $1 billion in a subway system in the middle of the suburbs, and then, okay, no one actually wants to live there, right? Yeah.
What are the best metrics for success in measuring a public transport system?
And can I tie in a related question?
Yeah.
What do you think is like the model city for incorporating all of these elements? And then
Okay.
how would you measure it to
The metrics of success are different, and when I say that, I mean, so one measure of success is time, right? The time you spend from point A to point B. But the convenience during that trip is also very important, right? So when I was doing my startup, one of the theories or the assumptions we had is that people were willing to spend more time in a vehicle if they don't have to transfer. Because at least in Brazil, it's very costly for the passenger to go to a stop, wait for a bus, get into the bus, go to another stop, change, wait for the other bus. There's a lot of points that something can go wrong, or a bus can be late, or you can get robbed, or something like that. So one of my criticisms with these transportation systems that are like light rail or BRT is that they're mostly focusing on time. It's like package delivery. That's how packages are delivered. They basically go into a hub, and then from this hub are distributed. But packages are not like people, right? They don't have, they can't be on their smartphones or working while they're traveling. So I think convenience is one of them, right? And time of travel is another one of them. And then you have all the other more maybe subjective, but like safety throughout the trip. Because, for example, in São Paulo, a lot of people use these motorcycles to transport themselves. And my guess is that in other places they don't, because it's just not safe. And people, they're willing to take the risk to go around the city like that. The fatality rate in traffic is much higher with motorcycles. Regarding Model City, it's hard to say. I personally have the concept of like successful cities is like the number of people who are living there times the real estate price of living in that city or something around that area. Because it's hard to say a city is successful or very good, and you just don't have a lot of people wanting to move there for some reason. Cities, a lot of urban economists consider cities like labor markets, so opportunities and just job opportunities are very important in every city. And regarding transportation, I mean, Singapore is interesting because they combined the land regulation authority with the transportation authority, so they can have kind of a general view on how to manage the infrastructure with the transportation solutions. And another interesting thing about Singapore is that while they did solve the traffic congestion problem, the traffic is so good in Singapore, and people, most citizens are kind of rich in Singapore because it's so expensive to live there. So a very large proportion of the Modeshare in Singapore is by car, is transportation by car, even though they have like a pretty good subway network and bus network. I'm a big fan of New York just because it's like very dense. It was one of other people. They were one of the first to implement this huge subway system, but in the other hand, it's also a very old subway system that has a lot of problems, a very high maintenance cost, and as we've seen, it's very hard to extend its lines. New York has also been kind of leading in some transformations, like the fact that they're considering a congestion charge is super interesting, and I personally hope it passes. I don't know. I like cities who are somewhat embracing change. So New York is one of them, and Singapore is another. Unfortunately, a lot of European cities have trouble doing that, just because they have preserved their urban cores for such a long time that they have this problem, right? It's like, okay, how do we deal with change now that we've invested so much in preserving this for so long?
Since you brought it up, what is the answer for New York with the legacy subway system? It's like, I live near 2nd Avenue, or I lived near 2nd Avenue, and that's like a 40-year project and dozens of billions of dollars. What do you do with I mean, generally with legacy infrastructure in a city? How do you fix it?
I don't know. So the thing is, it's one of the first times that we're seeing this,
Yeah.
right? New York was one of the first to implement the subway system, and it's really huge. And now, how do you deal with that? So, I mean, what Paris has been doing for a while is just continuous improvement of the stations and the lines and the trains. I'm not familiar with the details on how New York has dealt with that. I'm guessing these construction costs are a major barrier to do what European cities do. But if you go to Paris right now, you see a huge disparity in some stations, depending on if they have renewed it or not, right? So you'll probably see that for some time, and maybe Elon Musk has an answer. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
I'll make a small plug. We're trying to get together the broader urbanist community within Stanford. There are already a few groups that exist, like Sustainable Cities and Human Cities, and the undergrads have a fairly together community. If you're interested in that, we're going to be sending out some more things about it over time. We're probably going to build up sort of a leadership group and get something going.
It's great. Yeah, we have the leadership from the real estate club here, and we're interested in kind of going into that sphere as well. It kind of doesn't fall into like specifically into any group right now, but maybe we'll see a urban development club or something coming up in the next few years. I hope.